Welcome back to mysterious, sleepy history. Tonight, we're leaving the familiar world behind and traveling to a narrow stretch of water between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. On a map, it may not look particularly important, but through this narrow passage, enormous ships carry a significant share of the world's energy supplies. And for thousands of years, long before oil tankers and modern nations existed, merchants, sailors, kingdoms, and empires were already drawn toward these waters. Tonight, we'll explore the Strait of Hormuz. We'll discover where it is, why its geography made it so valuable, and how this small passage slowly became one of the most important crossroads in human history. And eventually, we'll arrive at the modern world, where the movement of oil and natural gas through this narrow gateway can affect economies far beyond the Middle East. So tonight, you don't need to search for answers or follow every detail. Just let the story unfold slowly around you. And before we begin, if you enjoy spending these quiet nights with us, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps our little group grow and brings more night travelers into our community. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what your local time is. It's comforting to know that somewhere out there, people around the world are sharing the same quiet journey together. So make yourself comfortable. Let your eyes grow heavy. And allow yourself to drift toward the warm waters of the Persian Gulf. Because sometimes, the places that look smallest on a map can hold the greatest stories. And the story of the Strait of Hormuz begins with a simple question. Why is this narrow passage so important? The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, separating Iran to the north from the Arabian Peninsula to the south. More specifically, the southern side of the strait includes Oman's Musandam Peninsula, which extends into the water and helps create the narrow passage, connecting the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman, and beyond that, the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. On a modern map, it can look like a relatively small feature between much larger bodies of land and water. Yet its position gives it an importance far greater than its size might suggest. To understand why, it helps to look at the geography around it. The Persian Gulf reaches deep into the Middle East and is surrounded by several countries whose economies have long depended on access to the sea. Iran lies along the northern coast, while Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman occupy much of the surrounding region. The Gulf itself is not an isolated body of water. It is connected to the wider world through the Strait of Hormuz. Ships traveling between the ports and energy-producing regions of the Persian Gulf and the open waters of the Indian Ocean have to pass through this gateway or use much longer alternative routes. The strait is about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, although the navigable shipping lanes occupy only part of that space. International shipping is organized into designated traffic routes so that large vessels can pass through the waterway safely in opposite directions. The geography is therefore not simply about a line on a map. The depth of the water, the surrounding islands, the shape of the coastline, and the narrowness of the passage all influence how ships move through it. And this is where the idea of a choke point becomes important. A maritime choke point is a narrow passage through which a large amount of international shipping must travel. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most important examples. If a ship is traveling from the Persian Gulf toward the Indian Ocean, There are not many practical alternatives that can replace the strait on the same scale. Some oil can be moved through pipelines across parts of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but these systems cannot simply absorb all of the cargo that normally moves by sea. The importance of the strait becomes much clearer when we look at what is transporting through it. The countries surrounding the Persian Gulf contain some of the world's largest petroleum reserves and are major producers of crude oil and natural gas. Much of this energy is produced for international markets rather than being consumed entirely within the countries where it is extracted. Large tankers therefore carry these resources from Gulf ports toward destinations across Asia and other parts of the world. During periods of normal traffic, roughly 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products can pass through the Strait of Hormuz each day. In the first half of 2025, the average was around 29 million barrels per day. That was approximately 1/5 of global petroleum liquids consumption and more than 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade. The strait is also important for liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Around 1/5 of global LNG trade has passed through Hormuz in recent years, with Qatar being particularly important because of its enormous LNG exports. These numbers explain why the Strait of Hormuz appears so often in discussions about global energy security. A tanker passing through the strait is not simply carrying a cargo from one Middle Eastern port to another. Its destination may be thousands of kilometers away. Much of the oil moving through Hormuz is headed toward Asian markets, including China, India, Japan, and South Korea. This means that the security and stability of the strait can have consequences far beyond the countries immediately surrounding it. But there is another reason the strait is so important. It is not only the amount of energy moving through it. It is the difficulty of replacing that movement if something goes wrong. If a road is blocked, traffic can sometimes take another road. If a railway line is closed, another route may be available. At sea, however, geography places much stronger limits on movement. A tanker cannot simply take a small detour around the corner. Alternative maritime routes can add enormous distances and costs, while pipelines have limited capacity and cannot carry every type of cargo. This is why even the possibility of disruption can have an effect. Ships may face higher insurance costs. Freight rates can rise. Energy traders can become nervous. Governments may release emergency reserves or search for alternative supplies. And markets can react before a complete shutdown has even occurred. There is also a military dimension to the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is surrounded by countries with important military forces and strategic interests in the Persian Gulf. Iran controls the northern coastline and several islands in the region. Oman controls the Musandam Peninsula on the southern side. The United States and other international powers have also maintained naval forces in the wider Gulf region for decades because of the importance of protecting commercial shipping and maintaining access to international waters. This does not mean that one country simply owns the entire strait or can treat it like a private waterway. Its legal status is much more complicated. Parts of the waterway fall within the territorial seas of Iran and Oman, while international maritime law provides important rights for ships traveling through international straits. The legal question of navigation through Hormuz has therefore been connected to wider disagreements between Iran, the United States, and other countries for many years. Yet even before modern international law, military strategy, and oil markets existed, the geography of Hormuz was already creating opportunities for trade. That is an important point because it changes the way we should understand this place. The Strait of Hormuz did not suddenly become important when oil was discovered. Oil transformed its importance and made its consequences global on an entirely different scale. But the basic geographical advantage had existed for centuries. The Persian Gulf has long connected different regions of the world. Merchants could travel between Persia, Mesopotamia, Arabia, India, and East Africa. Ships moved goods across the Gulf and then continued into the Indian Ocean. The winds of the Indian Ocean helped create seasonal trading patterns that connected distant ports. In this world, a well-positioned harbor could become wealthy simply because merchants needed somewhere to stop, trade, resupply, and continue their journeys. Hormuz was positioned near exactly such a crossroads. The island of Hormuz, which gave its name to the strait, became an important center of maritime commerce during the medieval period. Its rulers benefited from the movement of goods between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. Merchants from different regions passed through the area, and the port became associated with the wider trading network that connected the Middle East with South Asia and beyond. This means that the history of Hormuz is not really the history of one narrow piece of water alone. It is the history of a gateway. Whoever understood the value of that gateway could benefit from the movement of people, goods, and wealth between different worlds. And that is what makes the Strait of Hormuz so unusual. Its importance comes from several layers that have accumulated over time. First, there was geography. Then came maritime trade. Then kingdoms and empires competed for influence. Later, European powers arrived and tried to control the commercial routes. Finally, the discovery and massive expansion of the oil industry transformed the same passage into one of the most important energy choke points on the planet. Today, when we see a giant tanker moving slowly between Iran and Oman, we are looking at the latest chapter of a story that began long before the modern energy industry. The ships are different. The cargo is different. The governments are different. But the basic geographical reality remains the same. There is a narrow gateway connecting the Persian Gulf with the wider ocean. And as long as enormous amounts of energy and international trade depend on that gateway, the Strait of Hormuz will remain one of the most closely watched places on Earth. But if this narrow passage was already attracting merchants and rulers long before oil became valuable, another question naturally follows. What was moving through these waters before the age of tankers, pipelines, and modern energy markets? To answer that, we have to travel much further back into the history of the Persian Gulf and follow the ancient trade routes that first made Hormuz valuable. Long before oil tankers crossed the Strait of Hormuz, before modern borders divided Iran and Oman, and before anyone imagined that this narrow passage could influence the global economy, the waters of the Persian Gulf were already part of an ancient trading world. Thousands of years ago, merchants were moving goods between Mesopotamia, the Arabian Peninsula, Iran, Oman, and the lands farther east. The geography of the region created a natural connection between the great civilizations of the ancient Near East and the wider waters of the Indian Ocean. The story of Hormuz, therefore, begins long before petroleum. In the Bronze Age, the cities of southern Mesopotamia were becoming increasingly dependent on materials that were not easily available in their own lands. Mesopotamia had fertile rivers and productive farmland, but many of the raw materials needed for tools, weapons, buildings, and luxury objects had to come from distant regions. Copper was especially important. It was one of the essential materials used to produce bronze, which transformed warfare, agriculture, construction, and everyday tools. Stone, timber, precious materials, ceramics, and other goods also moved across long distances. The Persian Gulf provided one of the most practical ways to move these materials. Instead of transporting everything across the difficult landscapes of Arabia by land, merchants could use boats to move cargo along the coast and between the settlements surrounding the Gulf. One of the most important centers in this early trading world was Dilmun. Dilmun is generally associated with the region of modern Bahrain and nearby parts of the Gulf. Its position made it an important intermediary between Mesopotamia and the regions farther east. Goods arriving from the eastern Gulf could pass through Dilmun before continuing toward Mesopotamia. At the same time, products from Mesopotamia could travel in the opposite direction. Dilmun was therefore part of a much larger maritime network. Farther to the southeast was a region known in ancient Mesopotamian records as Magan. Magan is commonly associated with the area of modern Oman, although historians still debate the exact geographical boundaries of the ancient region. Oman was particularly valuable because of its copper resources. For the civilizations of the Bronze Age, copper was not simply another commodity. It was an essential resource for producing bronze, and bronze was fundamental to the technology of the ancient world. The connection between Mesopotamia and Oman therefore created an important economic relationship across the Gulf. But the trading world did not end at Oman. Farther east was the great civilization of the Indus Valley. During the 3rd millennium BC, long-distance connections developed between Mesopotamia and the civilization of the Indus Valley, located mainly in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. Mesopotamian records refer to a distant trading region known as Meluha, which many scholars associate with the Indus Valley civilization. Objects, seals, ceramics, and other archaeological evidence show that goods were moving between these distant societies. This means that thousands of years ago, the Persian Gulf was already connecting civilizations separated by enormous distances. It was not a single trade route. It was a network. A piece of copper from Oman could eventually reach Mesopotamia. Goods from Mesopotamia could travel toward the Gulf and then continue eastward. Materials from India could move west through the same broad maritime system. Different merchants controlled different parts of the journey. Different ports became important at different times, and different kingdoms rose and disappeared around the Gulf. But the geography remained. The Persian Gulf was connected to the wider Indian Ocean through a narrow entrance between the Iranian coast and the Arabian Peninsula. Today, we call this entrance the Strait of Hormuz. It is important to understand that ancient sailors did not think about the Strait of Hormuz in exactly the same way we do today. There were no modern shipping lanes, no tankers, and no political borders separating Iran from Oman. The strategic importance came from the geography itself. The Gulf was a large maritime basin, and ships traveling between its waters and the open Indian Ocean had to pass through its entrance. As ships and navigation techniques improved, the connections became even more extensive. Sailors learned to work with seasonal winds and currents. Merchants gradually became capable of traveling farther along the Arabian coast and across the Indian Ocean. The Persian Gulf became connected to an enormous maritime world extending from Mesopotamia and Arabia to India and eventually toward East Africa and Southeast Asia. And this trade carried much more than physical goods. Merchants carried languages, technologies, artistic styles, religious ideas, stories, and knowledge. The sea was becoming a highway between civilizations. Centuries passed. Kingdoms rose and disappeared. Persian empires expanded and contracted. Greek and Roman influence reached the region. Later, the rise of Islam created new political and commercial networks across the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. Arab and Persian merchants became major participants in a trading system that connected ports across Arabia, Persia, India, East Africa, and Southeast Asia. The political map changed constantly. The commercial geography did not. The entrance to the Persian Gulf remained a natural gateway, and eventually one particular name became closely associated with that gateway: Hormuz. By the medieval period, Hormuz had developed into an important commercial center linking the Persian Gulf with the Indian Ocean. Merchants arriving from India, Arabia, Persia, and other parts of the Indian Ocean world could meet there. The city and the surrounding kingdom benefited from its position. Control of the trade meant access to customs duties, ports, merchants, and valuable goods. By the 15th century, Hormuz had become important enough to attract merchants and travelers from some of the most distant parts of the known world. Even the great Chinese maritime expeditions led by Admiral Zheng, he reached Hormuz in the early 15th century. By this point, the name Hormuz represented far more than a narrow passage of water. It represented access to the Persian Gulf, access to the Indian Ocean, and access to one of the most valuable trading systems on Earth. But there is something remarkable about this entire history. For thousands of years, Hormuz mattered without oil. The ancient merchants who traveled these waters were not carrying crude petroleum to enormous refineries. They were carrying copper, stone, ceramics, textiles, spices, precious objects, and countless other goods. The importance of Hormuz came from its position between civilizations. Then everything changed. Oil transformed the meaning of this ancient gateway. In the 20th century, the Persian Gulf became one of the world's great centers of petroleum production. The same waters that had once carried ancient merchants began carrying enormous tankers filled with crude oil. And suddenly, a geographical feature that had been important for thousands of years became essential to the modern global economy. Today, more than 20 million barrels of oil and petroleum products can pass through the Strait of Hormuz in a single day during normal periods of high traffic. Huge quantities of liquefied natural gas also pass through the same narrow gateway. The numbers are difficult to imagine, but the principle is surprisingly simple. Thousands of years ago, merchants needed this passage to connect the Persian Gulf with the wider world. Today, the global energy system needs the same passage for many of the world's most important energy supplies. The cargo has changed. The ships have changed. The civilizations have changed, but the geography has remained almost exactly where it was, and that is what makes the story of Hormuz so unusual. Its importance was not created by oil. Oil simply revealed how powerful its geography had always been. But if this narrow gateway had already been valuable for thousands of years, what happened when foreign empires began to realize that whoever controlled Hormuz could influence one of the richest trading routes in the world? That is where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because the next people to arrive would not come simply as merchants. They would come with warships, and they would try to take Hormuz for themselves. By the late medieval period, Hormuz had become much more than a convenient stopping point for merchants. It had developed into one of the most important commercial centers of the Persian Gulf and the wider Indian Ocean. The rulers of Hormuz understood something that earlier kingdoms had already discovered. You did not necessarily need to control every mile of the surrounding sea to become wealthy. Sometimes it was enough to control the places where merchants had to stop, exchange goods, pay customs duties, and continue their journeys. The Kingdom of Hormuz emerged as a maritime power centered around the island of Hormuz and the surrounding territories. Its influence extended across parts of the Persian Gulf and into the trading networks of the Indian Ocean. The kingdom's wealth came largely from commerce. Ships arriving from India, Arabia, Persia, and East Africa brought valuable cargoes into its trading world, while merchants from the Gulf carried goods in the opposite direction. The island itself was not a large agricultural center. It had limited fresh water and relatively few natural resources compared with the mainland. Its real value came from its position. It stood close to the entrance of the Persian Gulf, in a location where ships traveling between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean could be monitored, and where merchants could be brought into the commercial system controlled by the rulers of Hormuz. This made the island an unusual kind of capital. Its power did not come from vast farmland or enormous armies. It came from trade. Merchants could find spices, textiles, precious objects, metals, and other goods arriving from distant regions. The port became a meeting point between different commercial worlds. Persian merchants interacted with Arab traders. Indian merchants arrived from the east. Ships from the western Indian Ocean brought goods from distant ports. Hormuz became a place where languages, religions, and cultures came together because commerce required them to. The wealth of Hormuz also attracted the attention of travelers from far beyond the Persian Gulf. The famous Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited the region during his journeys across the Islamic world. Later, European travelers described Hormuz as an extraordinarily wealthy trading center, filled with merchants and goods from different parts of Asia. But commercial wealth always creates a problem. The more valuable a place becomes, the more powerful the people who want to control it become. By the end of the 15th century, European powers were beginning to search for direct maritime routes to the markets of Asia. Portugal was at the center of this transformation. Portuguese sailors had spent decades exploring the Atlantic and the western coast of Africa. Their goal was eventually to reach the Indian Ocean without relying on the traditional overland and Middle Eastern trade routes. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India by sailing around the Cape of Good Hope. This changed the balance of power in the Indian Ocean. For centuries, merchants had relied on established networks connecting Arabia, Persia, India, and the Mediterranean. Portuguese ships now had a new route into the Indian Ocean, and the Portuguese crown wanted to control as much of the maritime trade as possible. The Portuguese were not interested only in buying and selling goods. They wanted to control the sea routes themselves. Their ships were heavily armed, and Portuguese commanders quickly began establishing fortified positions around the Indian Ocean. They attacked or pressured merchant vessels and attempted to force important ports into accepting Portuguese authority or paying for protection. The Persian Gulf soon became one of their targets. The reason was obvious. If Portugal could control the entrance to the Persian Gulf, it could influence the movement of enormous quantities of goods between the Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and that meant Hormuz. In 1507, Portuguese forces under Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in the region. Their objective was to establish Portuguese control over the strategic maritime gateway. After fighting in the area, the Portuguese gained a position on Hormuz, although their control over the kingdom developed through a complicated relationship with the local rulers rather than through the simple replacement of the entire government. The Portuguese built a fortress on the island. The fortress of Our Lady of the Conception, commonly known as the Portuguese Castle of Hormuz, became a physical symbol of their presence. From this position, the Portuguese could monitor shipping and strengthen their influence over the entrance to the Persian Gulf. But controlling Hormuz was not the same thing as controlling the entire Gulf. The Portuguese had powerful ships and fortifications, but they were operating far from their homeland and within a complex political environment. Persian rulers, Arab powers, local merchants, and other regional forces all had their own interests. And one of the most important powers in the region was the Safavid state of Persia. The Safavids had established a powerful Persian empire under Shah Ismail I at the beginning of the 16th century. They viewed Portuguese control of Hormuz as a challenge to Persian influence over the Gulf. For decades, the Portuguese maintained their position, but their presence never meant that the region had become politically simple. The Portuguese controlled important strategic points and collected revenue from maritime commerce, but they had to negotiate, fight, and cooperate with local powers at different times. Hormuz therefore became part of a much larger struggle. It was no longer simply a kingdom benefiting from international trade. It had become a prize in the competition between European maritime powers and the states of the Middle East. And eventually, another European power would enter the Persian Gulf. The English East India Company was expanding its commercial activities across the Indian Ocean, and England was increasingly challenging Portuguese influence in Asian waters. The Portuguese monopoly was beginning to weaken. At the same time, the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas I was determined to remove Portuguese influence from the Persian Gulf. In 1622, Persian forces, supported by an English naval squadron, attacked the Portuguese position on Hormuz. The Portuguese were defeated. After more than a century of Portuguese influence, their control of Hormuz came to an end. The island itself was devastated by the fighting, and the commercial center that had once been one of the great ports of the Indian Ocean never completely recovered its former position. But the importance of the location did not disappear. The Portuguese had come to Hormuz because of its geography. They left because they could no longer maintain control of it. And the struggle over the gateway continued. The great difference was that the Portuguese were no longer the only European power interested in the region. The English were becoming increasingly powerful in the Indian Ocean. The Dutch were expanding their own commercial empire. Persia was trying to strengthen its control over the Gulf, and the Ottoman Empire was also competing for influence across the broader region. Hormuz had once been a kingdom that grew rich by connecting merchants. Now it had become a place where empires competed for the right to control those connections. And this raises another question. If the Portuguese could be driven out of Hormuz, and if Persia regained control of the region, how did the struggle eventually move toward the age of European empires, British naval power, and eventually the discovery of oil? That transformation would take centuries, and it would change Hormuz forever. The Portuguese defeat in 1622 did not end the struggle for the Persian Gulf. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new phase. The Portuguese had spent more than a century building their influence around Hormuz, but when the fortress finally fell, another European power was already waiting to expand its own position in the region. That power was England. The English East India Company had been founded in 1600 with the goal of developing English trade with Asia. At first, the company was primarily interested in commerce rather than territorial conquest. English merchants wanted access to the valuable markets of India and the wider Indian Ocean, where spices, textiles, silk, and other goods could generate enormous profits. But the Portuguese controlled many of the most important maritime routes. This created an obvious conflict. The English did not need to conquer every Portuguese possession. They needed to weaken the Portuguese monopoly and open the sea to their own merchants. Persia offered an opportunity. Shah Abbas I, the powerful Safavid ruler, had his own reasons for opposing the Portuguese. He wanted to strengthen Persian influence over the Persian Gulf and remove Portuguese positions from territories he regarded as belonging to Persia. The interests of the two sides were therefore temporarily aligned. The English wanted to break Portuguese control. Shah Abbas wanted to remove the Portuguese, and Hormuz stood directly between them. The English East India Company had already established commercial contacts with Persia. By the early 17th century, English merchants had received trading privileges from Shah Abbas and established trading posts in several Persian cities. But the relationship became much more important when the Persian ruler decided to move against the Portuguese. There was one major problem. The Safavid state did not possess a powerful navy capable of carrying out the operation alone. The Portuguese, on the other hand, had ships, artillery, and fortified positions. Shah Abbas therefore needed ships. The English had them. In 1622, Persian forces under Imamkali Khan moved against the Portuguese positions on Keshem Island, which was strategically important because it provided access to fresh water for Hormuz. English East India Company ships supported the Persian operation. After Keshem was taken, the combined Persian and English forces turned their attention toward Hormuz itself. The siege lasted for weeks. Portuguese defenders resisted from their heavily fortified position, but the balance was turning against them. Persian troops attacked from the land, while English ships helped control the waters around the island. Eventually, on May 1, 1622, the Portuguese garrison surrendered. After more than a century of Portuguese control, Hormuz had fallen. The consequences were significant. For Portugal, One of its most important positions in the Persian Gulf was gone. For Shah Abbas, a major Portuguese presence had been removed from the entrance to the Persian Gulf. And for the English East India Company, the victory created an opportunity to expand its commercial presence in Persia. The English were rewarded with important trading privileges, including a major position at the new port of Bandar Abbas on the Persian mainland. This was one of the most important changes to come out of the struggle. Hormuz itself had been the great commercial center for centuries, but after its defeat, Shah Abbas did not try to restore the island to its former position. Instead, the commercial focus shifted toward the mainland. The port of Bandar Abbas grew rapidly and became an important center for international merchants. English traders established themselves there, and they were soon joined by merchants from other European countries. The Dutch East India Company also entered the Persian Gulf and became an important competitor. So the old Portuguese monopoly was replaced by something very different: competition. English merchants, Dutch merchants, Persian authorities, Arab merchants, Indian traders. And the Portuguese, although weakened, were not immediately removed from every part of the Gulf. The Portuguese continued to hold important positions in the region, particularly around Oman and Muscat, until Omani forces captured Muscat in 1650. The balance of power was therefore changing gradually rather than all at once. The English had helped Persia defeat the Portuguese, but the English were not doing this simply as a favor to Shah Abbas. They were building their own commercial empire. The East India Company was becoming increasingly powerful across the Indian Ocean, and commercial interests were gradually becoming connected with military and political influence. This was an important pattern that would define the next several centuries. European powers increasingly understood that controlling trade required more than simply having merchants in foreign ports. It required ships. It required fortified positions. It required agreements with local rulers. And sometimes it required military force. The Persian Gulf became part of this growing competition. For Persia, the challenge was to maintain control over its own coastline and protect its commercial interests. For Britain, the Gulf was becoming increasingly important because it provided access to markets and maritime routes connecting India with the Middle East. And for merchants, the region remained valuable because goods continued to move through it. The island of Hormuz itself, however, never fully recovered the commercial importance it had possessed before 1622. Its decline demonstrated something important. Control of a strategic location could bring enormous power, but political and economic centers could move. The geography of the Persian Gulf remained the same, while the ports and rulers controlling its commerce changed. Over the following centuries, British influence in the Persian Gulf would become much stronger. The East India Company would expand its network. British ships would increasingly patrol the waters. Treaties would bring Gulf rulers into Britain's sphere of influence. And by the 19th century, Britain would play a dominant role in the maritime affairs of the region. But there was still one transformation that would completely change the value of the Persian Gulf. For centuries, empires had fought over Hormuz because of trade. Soon, they would have another reason to care about the Gulf. Something beneath the ground would transform the region into one of the most strategically important places on Earth: oil. So how did a centuries-old trading route become the gateway for one of the world's most valuable resources? That is where the age of oil begins. For thousands of years, the importance of the Persian Gulf had been based on trade. Merchants came for spices, textiles, metals, pearls, and other valuable goods. Empires fought over ports because controlling those ports meant controlling commerce. Then, in the 20th century, something changed everything. Oil. The transformation did not happen overnight. Petroleum had been known in parts of the Middle East for centuries. Natural oil seeps existed around the Persian Gulf, and local communities had long been aware of the substance. But oil was not yet the foundation of the global economy. That began to change during the Industrial Revolution. As factories expanded, railways spread, ships became larger, and modern armies became increasingly mechanized. The demand for energy grew rapidly. Coal was still dominant, but petroleum had advantages that made it increasingly attractive. It could be refined into fuels that were easier to transport and use in engines. Then came the automobile. The spread of gasoline-powered vehicles created an enormous new demand for petroleum. At the same time, oil began transforming naval warfare. One of the most important figures in this transformation was Winston Churchill, who, before the First World War, supported the conversion of the British Royal Navy from coal to oil. Oil could allow warships to travel farther and refuel more quickly. But there was a problem. Britain had limited domestic oil production. The Persian Gulf suddenly became much more important. In 1908, oil was discovered in commercial quantities at Masjid Solomon in Persia, in what is now southwestern Iran. The discovery led to the development of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum. This was a turning point. The region that had once been known mainly for its ancient trading routes now possessed something that industrial powers desperately wanted: huge quantities of oil. The British government became increasingly involved in the petroleum industry of Persia. In 1914, shortly before the First World War, the British government acquired a controlling interest in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. The First World War then demonstrated just how important petroleum had become. Armies used trucks, tanks, and aircraft. Navies depended increasingly on oil. Military logistics became faster and more mobile. Oil was no longer simply another commodity. It was becoming a strategic resource. After the war, petroleum consumption continued to rise. Cars became common. Factories became increasingly dependent on petroleum products. Aircraft expanded. Modern militaries became heavily mechanized, and the Persian Gulf contained enormous reserves. As more oil fields were discovered across the region, the Gulf gradually became one of the world's most important sources of petroleum. But producing oil was only half the problem. The oil had to leave the region. And this is where the Strait of Hormuz became critically important. The Persian Gulf is surrounded by some of the world's largest oil-producing countries: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. Together, these countries became central to the global energy system. But much of the oil produced around the Persian Gulf had to travel by sea toward markets in Asia, Europe, and elsewhere. And the main maritime gateway out of the Persian Gulf was the Strait of Hormuz. The geography that had helped ancient merchants move goods between civilizations now connected some of the world's largest oil fields with the global economy. The ships changed dramatically. Small wooden trading vessels were replaced by enormous steel tankers. The cargo changed from spices and ceramics to millions of barrels of crude oil, and the scale of the trade became almost unimaginable. A single modern oil tanker can carry hundreds of thousands of barrels of crude. Thousands of such vessels have passed through the Gulf over the decades. The strait itself is narrow compared with the enormous volumes of energy that move through it. At its narrowest point, the strait is roughly 33 kilometers wide. But ships do not have unlimited space to navigate wherever they want. International shipping uses designated traffic separation schemes, with vessels traveling through specific lanes. This creates a remarkable situation. A relatively narrow geographical passage has become one of the most important points in the entire global energy system. The importance of Hormuz became even clearer during periods of conflict. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf became known as the Tanker War. Ships carrying oil were attacked by both sides, and international powers became increasingly concerned about the security of shipping through the Gulf. The United States and other countries eventually became directly involved in protecting commercial shipping. The conflict demonstrated something that had been developing for decades. A crisis in the Persian Gulf could quickly become an international crisis. The reason was not simply political, it was economic. If ships could not safely carry oil out of the Gulf, the consequences could spread far beyond the countries surrounding the strait. Oil prices could rise, insurance costs could increase, shipping could be disrupted, and countries thousands of kilometers away could feel the effects. The importance of Hormuz continued to grow as global oil consumption expanded. But oil was not the only energy resource changing the importance of the region. Natural gas became increasingly important as well. Qatar, located on a peninsula extending into the Persian Gulf, developed some of the world's largest natural gas resources. Much of Qatar's liquefied natural gas is transporting by sea, and once again, the Strait of Hormuz became an essential gateway. This meant that Hormuz was no longer simply an oil route. It had become an energy choke point. A choke point is a narrow geographical passage through which a large amount of international trade must pass. If that passage remains open, enormous quantities of goods can move through it. If it becomes blocked or severely disrupted, the effects can spread across the world. And Hormuz is one of the clearest examples of this phenomenon. In the first half of 2025, around 29 million barrels of oil and petroleum products passed through the strait every day. That represented roughly one-fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption. Around 11.4 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas also passed through Hormuz every day during the same period. These numbers explain why the strait is discussed whenever tensions rise in the Persian Gulf. The world is not watching Hormuz simply because it is a narrow piece of water. The world is watching because so much energy passes through it. And this is the extraordinary transformation of Hormuz. Thousands of years ago, merchants used the Gulf to move copper, ceramics, textiles, and other goods. Medieval rulers became wealthy by taxing international commerce. Portuguese ships arrived because they wanted to control the trade routes. The British later expanded their influence because the Gulf was becoming strategically important to their interests. Then oil transformed everything. The ancient trading gateway became an energy gateway, and the small stretch of water that had connected civilizations for thousands of years suddenly became connected to the daily lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world. But all also changed the political meaning of Hormuz. Countries were no longer simply competing for access to trade. They were competing for control, security, and influence over one of the most valuable energy regions on Earth. And as the 20th century progressed, one country in particular would become increasingly central to the story of Hormuz: Iran. But what happened when Iran's relationship with the Western powers changed completely? And how did the Iranian Revolution, followed by war and attacks on oil tankers, turn the Strait of Hormuz into an even more dangerous strategic flashpoint? For much of the 20th century, Iran had been closely connected to the Western powers. The country was ruled by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and Iran maintained strong political, economic, and military relationships with the United States and Britain. Its position on the Persian Gulf also made it an important regional power. But by the late 1970s, that relationship was beginning to collapse. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution transformed the country. The Shah was overthrown, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini became the central figure of the new Islamic Republic. Iran's relationship with the United States changed almost immediately. The country that had once been an important American partner in the Gulf was now openly hostile toward Washington. For Hormuz, this political transformation mattered enormously. Iran controlled the entire northern side of the strait and possessed one of the largest coastlines along the Persian Gulf. Its navy and military forces were therefore positioned close to one of the most important energy routes in the world. But the revolution was only the beginning. In September 1980, Iraq invaded Iran, beginning a war that would last for 8 years. The conflict quickly became one of the longest and most destructive wars of the modern Middle East. At first, much of the fighting took place on land. But as the war continued, both countries began looking for ways to damage the other's economy. And there was one obvious target: oil. Iran depended heavily on its oil exports. Iraq did as well. Both countries needed the revenue generated by petroleum to continue financing the war. Iran's major oil export facilities included Karg Island, located in the northern Persian Gulf. Iraq began attacking ships connected with Iranian oil exports, hoping to reduce Iran's ability to sell its petroleum abroad. Iran responded by attacking ships associated with Iraq, and increasingly, neutral shipping that it believed was supporting the Iraqi war effort. By the middle of the 1980s, attacks on commercial shipping had become a regular part of the conflict. This period became known as the Tanker War. The name sounds almost simple, but the reality was extremely dangerous. Oil tankers were enormous civilian vessels carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels of petroleum. They were not warships, yet they were suddenly sailing through waters where missiles, aircraft, mines, and patrol boats could turn an ordinary commercial journey into a military confrontation. Iraq used aircraft and anti-ship missiles to attack shipping connected with Iran. French-built super-attended aircraft and Exocet missiles became particularly associated with Iraqi attacks. Iran responded with its own attacks, including attacks against neutral vessels that it believed were assisting Iraq. The result was a growing danger for almost every ship operating in the Gulf. By the end of 1987, hundreds of attacks on shipping had taken place during the wider tanker war, involving vessels from many different countries. Merchant sailors were killed, wounded, or reported missing, and insurance costs for ships operating in the region increased dramatically. But there was an important difference between the tanker war and a conventional naval war. The objective was not necessarily to destroy every ship. The objective was to make the movement of oil dangerous and expensive, and that created an international problem. The Persian Gulf was not an isolated battlefield. Oil from the region was being purchased by countries all over the world. If shipping became too dangerous, the consequences could reach economies thousands of kilometers away. The United States therefore became increasingly involved. Kuwait, which feared that its tankers were becoming targets in the conflict, asked the United States for protection. Washington responded with a controversial plan. Several Kuwaiti tankers would be reflagged under the American flag. American warships would then escort them through the Gulf. The operation was called Operation Earnest Will. It officially began in July 1987 and became the largest U.S. naval operation since the Second World War. American warships escorted reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Persian Gulf, including their passage through the Strait of Hormuz. This created an extraordinary situation. American warships were now operating in waters directly connected to Iran. Iran saw the growing American military presence as a threat. The United States, meanwhile, argued that it was protecting freedom of navigation and international commerce. The tension became increasingly dangerous. In May 1987, an Iraqi aircraft mistakenly attacked the USS Stark, an American frigate, with Exocet missiles. 37 American sailors were killed. Although Iraq, rather than Iran, carried out the attack, the incident demonstrated just how dangerous the waters had become. Then, in April 1988, an American warship experienced one of the most serious incidents of the entire confrontation. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was escorting shipping in the Persian Gulf when it struck an Iranian mine. The explosion severely damaged the ship and injured several American sailors. The United States responded with Operation Praying Mantis. On April 18, 1988, American forces attacked Iranian naval and military targets in the Gulf. Several Iranian vessels and oil platforms were attacked during the operation, and the confrontation became one of the largest direct clashes between American and Iranian forces before the later decades of tension between the two countries. The danger did not end there. In July 1988, the USS Vincennes, an American guided missile cruiser operating in the Persian Gulf, mistakenly shot down Iran Air Flight 655. All 290 people aboard the civilian passenger aircraft were killed. The United States said that the crew had mistakenly identified the aircraft as an attacking Iranian military aircraft. For Iran, the incident became another devastating moment in an already bitter conflict. By this stage, the Iran-Iraq war had exhausted both countries. After 8 years of fighting, enormous human losses and widespread destruction, Iran accepted a ceasefire in 1988. The war finally ended in August. The tanker war ended with it. But the events of the 1980s had permanently changed the way the world viewed Hormuz. The strait was no longer simply an ancient commercial gateway or a route used by oil tankers. It had become a potential military choke point. The conflict had demonstrated that a relatively narrow stretch of water could bring major powers into direct confrontation. It had also shown something even more important. The security of Hormuz was not only an Iranian or Gulf issue, it was an international issue. A mine placed in the Gulf could damage an American warship. A missile fired at a tanker could affect international shipping. A disruption in oil exports could influence energy markets around the world, and a military confrontation near the strait could rapidly involve countries far beyond the Persian Gulf. The ancient gateway had entered a new era, but the Iran-Iraq War was only one chapter in the modern history of Hormuz. In the decades that followed, Iran and the United States would remain deeply suspicious of each other, while the strait would become increasingly important to the global energy system. And eventually, the world would begin asking a question that still matters today. What would actually happen if Iran decided to close the Strait of Hormuz? That question would turn this narrow passage from a historical trade route into one of the most closely watched places on Earth. For decades, the relationship between Iran and the United States has remained one of the most difficult relationships in the Middle East. After the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the two countries moved from being close partners to strategic rivals. Sanctions, military confrontations, disputes over Iran's nuclear program, and repeated tensions across the Persian Gulf gradually turned the relationship into something much larger than a disagreement between two governments. And at the center of that relationship was the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has always understood the geographical advantage of the strait. The country controls the entire northern coastline, while the southern side is controlled by Oman. Iran does not need to control every part of the waterway to create pressure. Its position gives it the ability to threaten shipping, monitor vessels, deploy naval forces, and make the possibility of disruption a constant concern for governments and energy companies around the world. For the United States, the calculation is very different. Washington has long considered freedom of navigation through international waterways to be a major strategic interest. The United States also has important military facilities and allies across the Persian Gulf. American naval forces have repeatedly operated in and around the region, partly to protect commercial shipping and partly to deter Iran from using military pressure against neighboring states or international vessels. This created a situation in which both countries had powerful reasons to remain in the same narrow stretch of water. Iran wanted to protect its security and maintain its leverage. The United States wanted to keep the sea lanes open, and oil made the consequences of any confrontation enormous. For years, tensions remained below the level of open war. There were confrontations involving Iranian patrol boats, American naval vessels, commercial tankers, sanctions, seizures of oil cargoes, and attacks on ships in the broader Gulf region. Then the nuclear dispute became increasingly important. The 2015 nuclear agreement had temporarily reduced some of the tension between Iran and Western powers. Under the agreement, Iran accepted restrictions on parts of its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. But in 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement under President Donald Trump, and restored major sanctions against Iran. Iran responded by gradually reducing its compliance with the agreement. The pressure increased. Iran's oil exports became a central target of American sanctions because petroleum revenue was one of the most important sources of income for the Iranian government, and this created an uncomfortable strategic question. If Iran could not freely sell its own oil, while other countries continued to export enormous quantities of petroleum through the Persian Gulf, how much pressure could Tehran exert on the route itself? The Strait of Hormuz became part of that answer. Iran repeatedly warned that if its oil exports were prevented, the security of the wider Gulf should not be taken for granted. For the United States, however, allowing a single country to threaten such a critical international waterway was unacceptable. The result was a cycle of pressure. Sanctions increased. Iran threatened retaliation. American forces increased their presence. Iranian forces demonstrated their ability to threaten shipping. And the markets reacted to every escalation. Then came the events of 2026. Military action involving Iran and the United States dramatically changed the situation. Beginning in late February, shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was severely disrupted. The waterway that had carried enormous quantities of oil and liquefied natural gas suddenly became extremely difficult for normal commercial traffic. The consequences were immediate. Oil production in several Gulf countries had to be reduced because producers could not move their supplies normally. Global inventories began falling, while governments and companies looked for alternative routes and alternative sources of energy. The United States also increased its involvement in the crisis. For Washington, the problem was no longer simply how to pressure Iran. It was how to restore the movement of energy through one of the world's most important maritime choke points without creating an even larger war. For Iran, the strait became an important source of leverage. The country's position meant that it could make the cost of the conflict much higher for the rest of the world. And this is what makes Hormuz so unusual. A country does not necessarily have to destroy the world's oil supply to create an international crisis. It only has to make the transportation of that supply uncertain. When shipping companies become afraid to send vessels through a particular route, insurance costs rise. When insurance becomes more expensive, transportation becomes more expensive. When transportation becomes uncertain, oil companies may reduce production. When supply falls, prices can rise. And when oil prices rise, the effects can eventually reach ordinary people through fuel, transportation, manufacturing, and food prices. A narrow passage of water can therefore connect a military confrontation in the Middle East to the daily lives of people thousands of kilometers away. By June 2026, the U.S. Energy Information Administration reported that the strait had effectively remained closed for more than 3 months, with shipping traffic extremely limited since the beginning of the conflict. The disruption had already forced major reductions in Middle Eastern oil production and contributed to a major drawdown in global oil inventories. There were attempts to reduce the tension. A ceasefire created hopes that shipping could gradually return. For a moment, markets responded positively to the possibility that Iran and the United States might reach an agreement that would allow the strait to reopen. But the reopening proved much more complicated than simply allowing ships to pass. Iran wanted guarantees. The United States wanted security and freedom of navigation. Both sides had political and military demands, and neither wanted to appear to have surrendered under pressure. By August, the situation remained unresolved. Iran was demanding major concessions from Washington before agreeing to fully reopen the strait, while the United States was demanding its own conditions. The result was a dangerous diplomatic standoff in which the future of one of the world's most important shipping routes had become tied directly to negotiations between two longtime rivals, and the rest of the world was watching. Because Hormuz is not important only to Iran or the United States. Japan depends heavily on energy transporting through the region. China is one of the world's largest importers of crude oil. South Korea relies heavily on energy imports. European countries are also affected by global energy prices and LNG supplies. Even countries that never receive a single tanker directly from the Persian Gulf can feel the consequences through the global energy market. That is why the Strait of Hormuz has become a crisis point again. The geography has not changed. The water is still narrow. The mountains of the Iranian and Omani coasts are still there. The ships still have to pass through the same maritime gateway. What has changed is the value of what is moving through it. Thousands of years ago, merchants carried copper, ceramics, and textiles through this region. Centuries later, empires fought for control of its ports. In the 20th century, oil transformed it into an energy gateway. And now, in the 21st century, Hormuz has become something even more complicated. It is simultaneously a trade route, an energy choke point, a military frontier, and a bargaining tool between powerful states. So perhaps the most important question is no longer simply whether Iran can close the strait. The real question is much larger. What happens to the world if a waterway carrying such a huge share of global energy can no longer be trusted? And if Hormuz can influence the price and availability of energy around the planet, just how much power does this narrow passage really hold? For thousands of years, the Strait of Hormuz has been a gateway between the Persian Gulf and the wider world. But in the modern era, the cargo passing through this gateway has become something much more consequential: energy. Oil and natural gas move through Hormuz every day in quantities large enough to affect countries far beyond the Middle East. That is why the question of what happens when the strait is closed is not simply a question about Iran, the United States, or the countries surrounding the Persian Gulf. It is a question about the global economy. During the first half of 2025, approximately 29 million barrels of oil and petroleum products passed through the strait every day. That was roughly one-fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption and more than 1/4 of the world's seaborne oil trade. But oil is only part of the story. Around 11.4 billion cubic feet of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, also passed through Hormuz every day during the same period. Much of that LNG came from Qatar, one of the world's largest natural gas exporters, and most of it was heading toward Asia. China, India, and South Korea are among the largest destinations for LNG traveling through Hormuz. For these countries, the strait is therefore not simply a line on a map. It is part of the supply chain that helps keep factories operating, homes supplied with energy, and electricity systems running. So what happens when that route suddenly stops? The first effect is not necessarily that the world immediately runs out of oil. That is an important distinction. The oil may still exist underground. The wells may still be producing. The problem is getting that oil to the people who need it. If tankers cannot safely leave the Persian Gulf, producers can quickly run out of storage space. Oil production may then have to be reduced because there is simply nowhere to put the additional crude. This is exactly what happened during the disruptions of 2026. As shipping through Hormuz became severely restricted, several major oil-producing countries in the Gulf were forced to shut in production. At one point, the Energy Information Administration estimated that around 10.5 million barrels per day of crude production from Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar and Bahrain had been shut in. This reveals something important about a closure. The impact is not limited to the oil that normally travels through the strait. A prolonged disruption can also reduce the amount of oil being produced in the first place. And once supply begins falling, the next part of the chain starts moving. Oil prices rise. In April 2026, Brent crude reached around $138 per barrel after having traded at much lower levels before the disruption. The reason is simple. Oil is traded in a global market. When buyers suddenly become uncertain about future supplies, they are willing to pay more to secure the barrels that are still available. That increase does not remain inside the Persian Gulf. It spreads through the international market, and eventually, consumers begin to notice it. Fuel becomes more expensive. Transportation becomes more expensive. Airlines face higher costs. Shipping becomes more expensive. Manufacturers pay more for energy. And because transportation is involved in almost every part of the modern economy, higher energy prices can eventually influence the cost of food and other everyday products. But oil is only half of the problem. The other half is natural gas. LNG is natural gas that has been cooled to an extremely low temperature until it becomes a liquid. This reduces its volume dramatically and makes it possible to transport natural gas by ship. Qatar has become one of the world's largest LNG exporters, and its enormous export facilities are connected directly to the Persian Gulf. When Hormuz is functioning normally, LNG tankers can leave Qatar and travel toward Asian and other international markets. When the strait becomes inaccessible, those ships face a much more difficult situation. During the 2026 disruption, more than 10 billion cubic feet per day of global LNG supply was affected, and the consequences appeared quickly in international gas markets. European and Asian LNG prices increased sharply after the closure, while the United States was affected very differently because it has large domestic gas production and its own LNG export infrastructure. This creates an important difference between the United States and many Asian countries. America has become one of the world's largest LNG producers and exporters. Japan, South Korea, and many other Asian economies, however, depend much more heavily on imported energy. So when LNG shipments from the Persian Gulf disappear, these countries have to compete for alternative supplies. They can purchase LNG from the United States. They can buy from Australia. They can search for additional cargoes from other producers. But there is a limit to how quickly the global LNG system can replace such a large missing volume. There is another problem. Alternative routes exist for some of the oil. Saudi Arabia has pipelines that can transport crude toward the Red Sea. The United Arab Emirates also has a pipeline system that can bypass part of the strait. Together, these alternative routes can move several million barrels of oil per day, but they cannot replace everything that normally travels through Hormuz. That is why the strait is considered a true energy choke point. A choke point does not necessarily have to be impossible to bypass. It only has to be difficult and expensive to bypass. And Hormuz is exactly that. If ships cannot pass through the strait, some cargoes may have to travel much longer distances. That means more fuel, more time, higher insurance costs, more expensive shipping, and greater uncertainty. The global energy system therefore begins to behave like a chain under pressure. One missing link creates pressure on the next. Oil supply becomes uncertain. Prices rise. Producers adjust their output. Refineries search for different crude supplies. Countries release emergency reserves. Shipping companies change routes. Gas buyers compete for LNG. And governments begin making decisions about how much energy they can afford to consume. The world does have emergency oil reserves for situations like this. Major economies maintain strategic petroleum stocks that can be released when supplies are disrupted. These reserves can help soften the immediate shock, but they do not create new oil. They simply buy time. If a disruption lasts for a few days, the world can absorb it much more easily than if it lasts for several months. Duration is therefore one of the most important factors. A short closure could create a sharp spike in prices followed by a gradual recovery. A prolonged closure could force major changes in production, shipping, and energy consumption. And a very long disruption could begin changing the structure of the global energy market itself. That is what made the events of 2026 so significant. The strait was not simply theoretically threatened. The world experienced what happens when traffic through Hormuz is severely disrupted. During the first quarter of 2026, oil flows through the strait fell to around 14.6 million barrels per day, compared with roughly 20 million barrels per day during the previous year. The reduction was enough to contribute to major production shut-ins and significant volatility in global oil markets. Yet eventually, shipping began to recover. A June 18 memorandum of understanding between the United States and Iran helped create the conditions for increased traffic through the strait. By July, the Energy Information Administration reported that shipping traffic had increased and expected global oil production and trade flows to move closer to pre-conflict levels by the end of the year. But the experience left behind an important lesson. The world does not need Hormuz to disappear completely for the strait to cause a global crisis. Even a major reduction in traffic can create enormous pressure. That is why governments watch every military movement around the strait. They watch every diplomatic statement. They watch every tanker. And they watch the price of oil. Because somewhere between the mountains of Iran and the coast of Oman lies a narrow passage through which an extraordinary amount of the world's energy must travel. For ancient merchants, Hormuz was a gateway to trade. For empires, it became a gateway to wealth. For modern economies, it became a gateway to energy. And that raises the final question. If so much of the world's energy depends on this narrow passage, who actually controls Hormuz today? Is it Iran? Is it Oman? Is it the United States? Or is the strait something that no single country can truly control? After thousands of years of history, the question seems simple. Who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz? The answer is more complicated than it first appears. No single country controls the entire strait. The waterway lies between Iran to the north and Oman to the south, connecting the Persian Gulf with the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. Its geography gives it extraordinary strategic importance, but its position cannot simply be reduced to saying that one country owns it. Iran, however, has an enormous geographical advantage. Its coastline stretches along the northern side of the strait, and Iranian naval forces operate close to the main shipping routes. Iran, therefore, has the ability to monitor maritime traffic and, during periods of conflict, to threaten or restrict the movement of vessels. Oman has a different but equally important position. The southern side of the strait includes Omani territory, particularly the Musandam Peninsula. Oman has traditionally maintained a more neutral position in regional disputes and has often acted as a channel of communication between Iran and Western countries. So when we ask who controls Hormuz, the answer is not simply Iran. Iran has enormous military and geographical leverage. Oman has sovereign territory and an important position on the southern side. And then there is another power that does not own the strait at all, but has repeatedly demonstrated that it can influence what happens there: the United States. For decades, the United States Navy has maintained a major presence in the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters. American forces have operated in the region to protect shipping, support regional allies, and deter Iran. This creates a remarkable situation. Iran is physically positioned at the gateway. Oman shares the southern side. The United States has the military power to operate far beyond its own coastline, and the world's energy markets depend on all of them avoiding a confrontation that could seriously disrupt the waterway. That is why Hormuz is more than a geographical location. It is a balance of power, and that balance has become especially important in recent years. The rivalry between Iran and the United States has repeatedly brought the strait into the center of international attention. Sanctions against Iran, disputes over its nuclear program, attacks and seizures involving commercial vessels, and military confrontations in the Gulf have all demonstrated how quickly tensions can spread into the waters around Hormuz. For Iran, the strait provides something extremely valuable: leverage. Iran does not need to destroy the global oil market to create pressure. It only needs to make shipping through the strait uncertain. If a tanker company believes that sending a vessel through the strait has become too dangerous, it may delay the voyage. If the risk increases, insurance costs can rise. If insurance becomes more expensive, transportation becomes more expensive. And if enough companies begin avoiding the route, the effects can quickly spread through the global energy market. This is why Hormuz is considered one of the world's most important maritime choke points. Its power does not come from its size. It comes from what passes through it: oil, natural gas, commercial shipping, and the economic expectations of entire countries. During normal periods, enormous quantities of petroleum and LNG move through the strait every day. When that traffic is disrupted, the consequences can reach countries thousands of kilometers away. China watches, India watches, Japan watches, South Korea watches, European governments watch, energy companies watch, and financial markets watch. Even countries that never receive a tanker directly from the Persian Gulf can feel the consequences through global energy prices. But there is something even more fascinating about Hormuz. Its importance has changed throughout history, while its geography has remained almost exactly the same. For ancient civilizations, it was part of a maritime trading network. For the Kingdom of Hormuz, it was a source of wealth. For the Portuguese, it was a strategic gateway into the Persian Gulf. For the British, it became part of a much larger imperial network. For the modern oil industry, it became an energy choke point. And today, it has become a place where geography, energy, military power, and diplomacy all meet. That is why the whole world watches this narrow passage. Not because it is the largest body of water, not because it contains the world's largest port, and not because one country simply owns it. It matters because the modern world has built an enormous economic system around a geographical passage that cannot easily be replaced. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of years ago, merchants sailed these waters because Hormuz connected different civilizations. They carried goods from one part of the world to another. Centuries later, empires arrived because they wanted to control those same connections. Today, enormous tankers pass through the same waters carrying the energy that powers modern economies. The ships have changed. The cargo has changed. The technology has changed. But the geography has not. The gateway is still there. And that may be the greatest reason Hormuz has remained important for so long. Geography is patient. Empires disappear. Governments change. Trade routes evolve. Technology transforms the world. But a narrow passage between two bodies of land remains where it has always been. That is the strange power of places like Hormuz. Their importance is not created entirely by the people who live around them. It is partly created by the shape of the earth itself. And once humanity builds its trade and energy systems around such a place, moving away from it becomes extraordinarily difficult. That is why a small stretch of water can become a global pressure point. It is why a decision made in Tehran can affect markets in Tokyo. Why a military movement in the Persian Gulf can influence energy prices in Europe. Why a tanker waiting at the entrance of a narrow strait can become part of a much larger geopolitical story. And why, even after thousands of years, the world continues to look toward Hormuz. Perhaps the real question, then, is not simply who controls the strait. Perhaps the more interesting question is this: how can one narrow passage of water remain important to so many civilizations, kingdoms, and powerful nations for thousands of years? The answer begins with geography. Geography created the gateway. Trade gave it value. Empires fought over it. Oil transformed it. And modern geopolitics turned it into a global pressure point. Tonight, we have followed the story from the earliest trading networks of the Persian Gulf, through the Kingdom of Hormuz, the Portuguese and the British, into the age of oil, the tanker war, and the long rivalry between Iran and the United States. And after all those centuries, one thing has remained remarkably constant. The world still has to pass through Hormuz. Perhaps that is why this small stretch of water has survived every transformation around it. Civilizations changed. Empires disappeared. Ships became larger. Cargoes became more valuable. But the gateway remained. And now, as our journey comes to an end, the waters of the Persian Gulf can slowly fade into the darkness. The ships continue moving across the sea. The lights of the distant coastline remain visible. And somewhere between Iran and Oman, The same narrow passage continues connecting one world to another. The Strait of Hormuz has witnessed merchants, sailors, kings, empires, wars, and the rise of the modern energy age. It has watched history pass through its waters. And perhaps tomorrow, the ships will continue their journeys just as they have for thousands of years. But tonight, you don't need to follow them any farther. You can simply let the story settle. Let the sound of the sea carry you away from the Persian Gulf. Let the ancient trading routes disappear into the darkness. And remember that some places in history are powerful not because they are enormous, but because they are impossible to ignore. Hormuz is one of those places. This is the true story of the Strait of Hormuz. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey through history. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history.